Good morning everyone. My name is Jaime Turnbull and I'm a current honours student with the Future Child Health Team with the Kids Research Institute of Australia and the University of Western Australia. Today I'll be presenting the first of two papers that I'm completing this year as part of my honours degree, and this paper is a global systematic review that is looking at how climate change is degrading the health and well-being of Indigenous children globally. I can also confirm that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, extending that respect to all Indigenous peoples globally and to any Indigenous peoples here in the room today. Throughout this presentation, I've included artwork by Indigenous artists from around the world as a way of honouring and respecting Indigenous voices throughout, and each piece reflects the climate health focus of my presentation. So as 5 of our 6 co-authors on this paper are non-Indigenous and Western trained researchers, it is critical that I acknowledge our positionality as outsiders for lived experiences and cultural knowledges of Indigenous peoples globally. So in recognition of this, our research took a very reflexive and decolonising approach, and this was guided by meaningful engagement and co-authorship with Dr. Mara West. Our research also respects Indigenous formed health definitions and global Indigenous diversity. So why this topic? So globally, climate change is exacerbating adverse health outcomes with specific demographics disproportionately affected. So while we recognise that global experiences of climate health outcomes are all diverse, research shows that generally children experience heightened risk due to biological and developmental vulnerabilities, and Indigenous peoples experience heightened risk due to the complex interplay of pre-existing factors such as colonial histories, systemic inequalities, and environmental injustices that continue today. So this Venn diagram on the screen illustrates how Indigenous children face a compounded risk and vulnerability due to both of these connecting factors. However, despite this increased susceptibility to climate-related health impacts, Indigenous children have received very little attention in climate health research to date. And so this is the gap that our research aimed to address. So our systematic review was guided by the question, what are the impacts of climate change on the health outcomes of Indigenous children globally? So our systematic review followed PRISMA reporting guidelines as illustrated in this diagram on the screen. So on the 2nd of March 2025, we conducted a 5 database search which retrieved 2020 results. From there, using Covidence, we deduplicated the results, and then 3 independent reviewers screened 1,482 abstracts and then 281 full texts to result in 54 studies being included in the final review. So let's take a quick look at the characteristics of these included studies. So this figure on the screen maps the geographical distribution of Indigenous populations represented in these included studies. And as you can see, there is a strong concentration of studies in high-income countries, with USA, Canada, and Australia accounting for over half of these included studies. So this exposes a real regional bias in the existing evidence base. So turning to representation, half of these included studies were what we categorise as disaggregated, and this meant that they reported specific findings for Indigenous children, while the other half were what we categorised as aggregated, meaning that while Indigenous children were included in these studies in some way, there was no specific findings reported for them. However, we decided to include these aggregated studies given our anticipated scarcity of studies overall, but we analysed these two groups separately, recognising that aggregated reporting limits the true visibility of Indigenous children. So for quality assessment, we use 2 distinct tools that are importantly not directly comparable. So for the quantitative studies, there were 28 of those, and we used grade, and as you can see in red, majority of these studies had very low certainty, and this was mostly due to methodological limitations. While for the 22 qualitative studies, we used CAST, and as you can see in the dark blue, majority of these studies had high quality, and this mostly reflects their strong community engagement and ethics. And for the 4 mixed method studies, we used both tools for their corresponding components. So due to the scarcity and the variety of these included studies, a meta-analysis was not feasible for this review. So instead we used a matrix mapping approach. So we reviewed each study and tabulated key characteristics and then mapped the studies across 2 matrices, one for disaggregated studies and one for aggregated studies, depending on the climate change exposures and the health outcome combinations that they analysed. So this figure on the screen shows one of the visual representations of these completed matrices. Up at the top are the health outcome categories in the key, and then along the x-axis are at the top are the climate change exposure categories, and along the x-axis are the health outcome categories, and along the y-axis are the frequencies. So one key finding that stood out for us is that many of the studies didn't just analyse one climate change exposure and health outcome combination. This meant that they had to be mapped across multiple cells in the matrix, and this is why the total number of studies and the frequency of studies exceeds the total number of studies in this review, which was 54. So one key example of this is the psychosocial and cultural well-being health outcome category, and as you can see, this outcome is interlinked and interconnected with all but one of the climate change exposures. And while not depicted in this visual representation, this outcome is also interconnected with all other health outcomes across studies. So this shows how climate change is impacting the health of Indigenous children in very interconnected ways globally, and this importantly reflects Indigenous knowledge systems and health conceptualizations that recognise that health and well-being are inseparably connected to land, culture, community, spirituality, and broader determinants of health. So importantly, a key takeaway from this is that Indigenous knowledge systems are critical in both understanding the impact of climate change on Indigenous children's health, but also in guiding responses. Responses, in order to be truly effective and culturally responsive, could not just centre upon one climate change exposure or health outcome in isolation. They need to take a more multidimensional approach, drawing on Indigenous ways of knowing. So building upon this matrix mapping approach, we then conducted a theme-based narrative analysis across all studies grouped by health outcome. However, to avoid homogenising and overgeneralising the sheer diversity of Indigenous experiences within the time frame of this presentation, I've chosen two examples to focus on today. So firstly, Inuit children in Arctic Canada. So across the studies, it was highlighted that as seasons warm, this disrupts and makes the ice conditions unstable, which disconnects Indigenous Inuit children from traditional land-based activities, which disrupts intergenerational knowledge transfer, driving ecological grief among Inuit children. The second example, Samane children in Bolivia. Here, studies highlighted that climate-related flooding decreases access to water and food, which increases the prevalence of malnutrition and diarrheal illnesses among Samane children. And as depicted in this image, this vulnerability is exacerbated by existing determinants, such as remoteness in this case, showing a doctor having to use a boat in order to access a remote Samane community after a flood. So importantly, this theme-based analysis highlighted that while the impacts of climate change on Indigenous children's health is very interconnected, it is also very diverse, as it's deeply shaped by pre-existing determinants, such as local environments, cultural practices, and structural inequalities that interact and amplify climate change exposures, increasing susceptibility for risk. So importantly, as there are only 54 studies included in this review, it is clear that more research in this area is needed. However, we also highlight two specific gaps in the current evidence base. First, distributional gaps. We recommend that research needs to expand into underrepresented regions in order to better reflect the global diversity of Indigenous children's experiences. And second, limited disaggregated data. We recommend that studies should prioritise disaggregating results both by Indigenous identity and age, and then cross-stratify these results to focus on Indigenous children more specifically. However, it is important to note that while we do recommend more research in this area, this research has to be conducted in culturally responsive and respectful ways in order to truly be beneficial. So after we completed the analysis of all included studies, another finding was identified, and this was that many of the studies didn't only portray Indigenous children as vulnerable, they actually highlighted Indigenous children's active capacity in climate health responses. And we realised that this aligned with existing international health and right frameworks that are emphasising that there needs to be more involvement of Indigenous children and youth in climate health responses that are affecting them. So building upon these results, we developed this cyclical, strength-based and relational guiding framework that centres Indigenous youth and children in climate health responses. So this framework forms an amplifying positive feedback loop whereby engagement with younger generations drives forward interconnected outcomes that reinforce each other over time. So if we start over here in the blue, you can see that engagement with younger generations improves the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems into responses. And this is through cultural processes such as intergenerational knowledge transfer and cultural continuity. This then flows into the second outcome, which is process-based health and wellbeing benefits. So here, engagement in responses becomes a source of health and wellbeing for the engaged Indigenous children. And this is because increasing connection to Indigenous knowledges and culture strengthens senses of belonging, identity, self-determination, and empowerment, which are all strong foundations of health and wellbeing. So this then flows into the third outcome in purple, which is improved strategic and practical responses. So this is where, when responses engage with younger generations and include Indigenous knowledges, they become more strength-based and culturally responsive. This enables them to be more Indigenous-led, strength-based, child-centred, and reflective of ethical approaches. So all three of these outcomes then lead into the final outcome in green, which is implementation-driven health and wellbeing benefits. So these are the more long-term and sustained health and wellbeing benefits for Indigenous younger generations engaged in climate health responses, and these arise from a combination of the other three outcomes, such as increased connection to Indigenous knowledges, improved senses of wellbeing, and improved strategic and practical responses. And these include capacity for future action, intergenerational resilience, climate health literacy, and community leadership. And importantly, this allows the cycle to continue again and strengthen over time. So to conclude, this is the first review of its kind. It's the first to consolidate evidence indicating that Indigenous children globally are experiencing a diverse range of interconnected and adverse climate health impacts. Importantly, our research takes a strength-based approach. It emphasises the importance of centering Indigenous knowledge systems and elevating Indigenous children's voices in climate health research and responses. Our hope is that our research can offer a child-focused contribution to support the long-standing and ongoing advocacy of Indigenous peoples globally, to indigenise and decolonise both research and health in the climate health space. Currently, I am in the process of completing my second honours paper for this year, and this paper bridges evidence and action. It takes the next step and it looks at how the findings of this review are being addressed in global policy. So thank you all for your time today. I'd like to quickly acknowledge the Future Child Health team, whose website is here on the screen, and my co-authors and co-supervisors, Dr. Melinda Judge and Professor Peter LaSwift, for all their guidance and support so far throughout my honours degree. This paper is currently still under review, but a preprint is available via this QR code. Thank you.